Welcome to another edition of the CLLT Corner podcast. I am your guest host, Mike Lederer, and I am thrilled to be joined by Keyonda Smith, 2U's content accessibility lead, to discuss all things accessibility. Before we get into the specifics around content accessibility here at 2U, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. How did you get into this work, and what makes you passionate about accessibility and inclusivity?
Well, thank you, Mike, for the invite. I'm very happy and pleased to be here with you and our audience today. I was first introduced to digital accessibility in the late 90s, like 1990, early 2000s. And I was actually serving as faculty at a small community college where we had a order to get online. They were like, hey, everyone's going online. Now it's time for us to get online. So there was no resources for us to reach out to. There were very little providers of LMSs. However, Blackboard was available, and it was like the early implementation of Blackboard. I was able to spearhead that project and get us online. My dean there told another university in Atlanta, Georgia about what I did for them, and they wanted me to come to Atlanta and do it for them. My students jumped from 400 to 6,000. So therefore, I never thought about accessibility at the community college because the student body was so small. When I got over to Atlanta, it was so large that accessibility became a major issue and it turned into accommodations. So to make all the courses accessible to everyone, I went on and learned what I could about the industry as much as possible. And this was about 20 years ago. So it was a little different than what it looks like today. And so I joined a lot of organizations. I went to a lot of conferences. And all this time, I was in the middle of finishing my PhD. So I changed the topic to align with what I was currently working on. So that means that I conducted an extensive amount of research on digital accessibility, and specifically in higher education. The most important part that I learned is that I was able to join some organizations that would be at the forefront of making changes and differences for the criteria and regulatory bodies that we have today, which more importantly, it's W3C, WCAG. And while sitting on that board, I have learned that not only about digital accessibility standards and requirements here in the United States, but also on an international scale. That is extremely useful for universities that accept students from all over the world. So I also understand how to make things digitally accessible for English language learners and where English is a second language to them. So I chose to make this my concentration and a focus on my career moving forward.
That's so interesting. And you mentioned you sit on the board for W3C, WCAG. For our listeners that may not know, what is that? What is it comprised of?
So the W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium. It's an international community where member organizations consist of full-time staff as well as public individuals who work together to develop the accessibility standards that are sponsored by the GSA government-wide accessibility program. So the W3C process, in cooperation with board members and volunteers and organizations around the world, we have worked very hard to develop a single shared standard for digital content and digital content accessibility. And we named it Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG. And that document explains how to make digital content more accessible and generally refers to the information in the digital applications, including natural information such as your text, images, and sounds, as well as your coding or markup language that may define structure or presentation.
So interesting. And I can only imagine that sitting on that board of being, a part of helping to define those guidelines can have a tremendous impact here at 2U. And when we think about our 2U courses and the products that we deliver, what should accessibility mean as we're thinking about how we build things out?
Well, I do appreciate you for specifying accessibility in terms of 2U products because there is a physical accessibility component and then there is a digital accessibility. We are focused here on digital accessibility, and that is the practice of making 2U products usable by as many students and faculty and staff. We traditionally think of this as being about people with disabilities, but the practice of digital accessibility also benefits other groups, such as those using alternative devices or those working on slow network connections, or they are stationed in a rural location. And then there's usability and equity that comes into play because some people are only learning using their mobile devices. They may only have a cell phone to take their classes, or they only may have a tablet. So that's where we get into access.
So access and usability and equity, it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities. And what opportunities do you see to improve our, overall digital accessibility approach here at 2U? And why did you ultimately choose to join us here?
I will say this is a fascinating time that presents an excellent opportunity for us to inject diverse perspectives to improve or redefine WCAG guidelines. What I mean by that is WCAG 3.0. Anyone who knows about accessibility, you'll know we've been waiting for about 4 years for this to come about at fruition. And it's here, it's available. We're just waiting on government checkoff. So I truly believe that 2U has the opportunity and the platform to potentially become a leader in its adoption and uptake. I envision 2U as a thought partner in outlining suggestions and recommendations for achieving conformance and compliance, improving accessibility, supporting digital equity, and narrowing this digital gap for the most ubiquitous group of individuals without regard to abilities. So this is why I chose to serve here at 2U. The reach and impact that we have here is astronomical.
Since I've been at 2U, we've always provided closed captioning and transcription for any produced video through our vendor relationship with 3Play Media. But captions and transcriptions are just a small part of what it means to create accessible courses. What else should our listeners be considering beyond just closed captioning and transcription?
Unfortunately and fortunately, as a consequence of technology innovation and improved government guidelines, closed captioning is obviously an excellent component of everyone, including individuals who are identified as disabled or those who may need closed captioning for optional reasons, like they're watching in an open area or looking at something at work. But once again, this is not an accommodation. So instead, it's about access, accessibility, and equal rights. Now, I've noticed here at 2U that we may need to pay closer attention to how the language is used in our multimedia. Using words such as look here or on the right of your screen. Also, information on the duration or how long a video is before it is selected and whether or not the video opens into a new window. If it does, let the users know that it's opening into a new window, because some individuals may lose their place in navigation when they're not informed. A new window has been opened, or they may even get logged out of the system.
Something that stuck with me a couple of years back was the concept of baking digital accessibility into the overall design process rather than bolting it on at the very end. How should we be thinking about the opportunities we have to influence course design with accessibility in mind versus simply remediating delivered assets at the end of the process?
Firstly, we need to understand that accessibility is remediated and it's solved at the design stage. So one of the most prevalent issues when developing and designing for accessibility is understanding the requirements that you're designing for. I know that developers are not deliberately designing to exclude users. It's just that they may not know what they don't know. So as it pertains to accessibility, there is an enormous amount that goes into it, and it requires developers to view design with various lenses, which may be unrealistic for some. So accessible design transpires when developers view their design from multiple perspectives or various perspectives and lenses during this design phase of the project, not at the end. And even though remediation is a verified remedy to conform with understood accessibility specifications, most fall short on integrating remediation correctly. When I assist with accessibility remediation, I offer support for every medium, including Word, PDFs, closed captioning, audio descriptions, and all web and online digital material to determine its accessibility. Knowledge of free automatic tools such as Word, PowerPoint, PDF checkers, as well as the online content accessibility tools like Wave, Axe, and Andy. These are tools that are free and open to the world, and they are of the utmost importance in making sure that early on in the process, you don't have to be a wizard or you don't have to have studied accessibility for 20 years in order to make your items accessible.
I feel like we could talk about this topic for so much longer, and maybe we'll have to invite you back for another podcast to dive into even more specifics around all things accessibility. Keyonda, thanks so much for joining me, and thanks to each and every one of you for listening to another edition of the CLLT.